Hello, dear friends. Today we will continue our journey through Otto Carius's memoirs. In this part of his memoirs, he takes part in heavy fighting near Neville, which was foolishly lost by German troops due to the incompetence of their command. Don't forget to leave your opinion about this material and support this video with a like. Well, let's begin. Defensive battle at Neville. The front at Lake Ladoga had calmed down to a certain extent, but before we had time to catch our breath, we unexpectedly received an order to march to the Neville area. The Russians attacked and took the city. The attack was so unexpected that some of our troops were caught in transit. Real panic ensued. It was only fair that the commandant of Neville had to answer to a military court for his blatant disregard for security measures. We were tasked with ensuring, at all costs, that the Velikie Luki to Neville to Vitebsk highway remained open so that the infantry could take up the most advantageous positions possible east of the road. It was assumed that the Russians would be pushed back again. We soon learned, during a series of unforeseen events, what kind of enemy we were dealing with. There had been a gap in our front line south of Neville since the winter of 1941/42. It was considered a natural obstacle because the terrain was completely swampy. To everyone's surprise, after the breakthrough to Neville, it was discovered that small Russian units had managed to sneak through the swamp to disrupt traffic on the highway. I was sent ahead with one tank to provide cover. The rest of the company was to follow. There were no signs of the enemy. The highway we were to guard stretched out before us from right to left. It went up to the right and disappeared behind a hill about 2,000 meters away. The rest of our battalion was to come out to us from that direction and reinforce our line between Lovitz and Neville. That was on November 4th. We got out of the tank. My mechanic driver, Sergeant Kessler, was repairing the damaged left track. Standing in the open, we noted with satisfaction that our tanks were rolling toward us on the road over the aforementioned rise. At least, the radio operator did not report anything to me that would disturb this idyll. When I got a better look at the first tanks, I involuntarily shuddered. There were infantrymen sitting on them. It was the Russians who personally honored us with their presence. In the blink of an eye, we were all back in our places. But the Russians did not even pay attention to us. They probably thought our vehicle was damaged and did not expect to engage in combat with the enemy. My driver, Kessler, practically ruined everything. He always flew into a rage when tanks appeared. In his opinion, we never opened fire quickly enough. He would have preferred to ram the enemy tanks. He had already started the engine and again demanded that we open fire, not understanding our calmness. My gunner, Sergeant Clagius, was one of those former university students who knew how to enjoy a drink. Unlike his former superiors, I got along well with him. Unfortunately, we parted ways because his request to continue his studies was granted. So, just as I was about to give the order to open fire, Kessler lost his patience and tried to move forward. The Russians at the head of the column were now no more than 60 meters away from us. At that very moment, Clagius lit them up with a shell that hit between the turret and the hull. The tank slid to the side of the road and caught fire. The crew showed no signs of life. The Russian infantry scattered across the area adjacent to the road. Klaus took care of the remaining enemy tanks. They bumped into each other in confusion, turned around, and did not even think of fighting us. Only 2 of the 12 T-34 tanks escaped our fire. In the evening, I was called back north. We had to carry out a small operation near Shelkunitsa. Anti-aircraft gunners replaced us at our previous position to ensure security. I returned 2 days later. A tank from the 3rd Company was assigned to me as reinforcement. It was commanded by Feldwebel Dietmar. We no longer counted how many Russian tanks were left after the enemy had been so thoroughly defeated. However, as a rule, we underestimated the tenacity of the Russians. They appeared at noon in the same place as 2 days ago, but this time they closed the hatches, preparing for battle, and turned the turrets halfway to the right. Apparently, the enemy recognized only the anti-aircraft gun and completely overlooked us, the main villains. The enemy tanks, there were 5 of them, tried to drive around their burned-out vehicles. They made their biggest mistake by only surveying the elevated terrain as they moved. By opening fire, very inaccurately, by the way, they disturbed the artillery crew, which was relying entirely on us. We knocked out 3 tanks. The anti-aircraft gunners, who had been rudely disturbed, took care of the rest. Shortly thereafter, we climbed a hill for a brief reconnaissance. The Russians had brought additional military equipment through the swampy, roadless terrain. In the evening, we returned to our previous position. There, we were given the task of occupying the village behind the hill the next morning. We were thus to pave the way for an infantry regiment. 2 more tanks and 3 quadruple anti-aircraft guns were assigned to me by the time dusk fell. These weapons performed brilliantly in action against ground targets. It was a moonlit night. I decided to attack as soon as possible, believing that the element of surprise would somewhat compensate for the enemy's numerical superiority. We lined up with my Tiger at the front. The tanks and anti-aircraft guns followed behind. Using smoke screens, we got very close to the village. Strangely enough, not a single shot was fired. Perhaps the Russians thought we were one of their marching columns. We stopped right in front of the village, and the anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Without waiting for my order, the gunner also opened fire on the houses to the left of the highway. As a result, the east wind carried thick smoke through the streets, obscuring our view. In the village, we destroyed 3 Russian anti-tank guns set up next to the houses. We spread out to ensure safety and made contact with the regiment. The regiment approached, the soldiers combed through the houses, and in the morning, we continued our journey north. The raid was completed without any losses on our side. Only 2 Russian tanks managed to escape. If we had waited until daybreak to start moving, the enemy would have unleashed their firepower on us, as far as we could tell from the captured equipment. Despite all our precautions and attempts to surround them, the Russians continued to successfully infiltrate our front line through an old breach. They built a long, narrow artery through which they transferred more and more people and equipment. With our weak forces, we were unable to block this area of their penetration, cut off the Russians, and destroy the pocket that had formed. With each passing day, the danger increased that this artery would explode and the Russians would surround us. During the Russian campaign, the following question was often asked: who is surrounding whom? We were thus moved westward to prevent further advances from this artery. The terrain was completely unsuitable for tanks. Despite the frost and snow, there were strips of swamp here and there where we could get stuck. We were not particularly afraid of the forests and considered that, compared to the conditions in the northern sector of the Eastern Front, it was not bad here. On November 10th, we counterattacked near the village of Pugachino and prevented the artery from expanding. Our route ran for about 5 kilometers through a forest where the Russians had recently captured 2 German long-barreled 88mm anti-tank guns. We found these guns intact and in good condition. It was clear that the Russians did not know how to use them. We had no choice but to blow these undamaged guns to pieces. We did not want to give the Russians another chance to test their ability to master unfamiliar technology on us. We were somewhat careless as we continued to advance after that, and soon the sound of gunfire could be heard from all sides. One of our vehicles was immediately engulfed in flames. Fortunately, the crew was able to escape by transferring to another tank. We quickly began to retreat to the main road, convinced that the enemy was advancing with small forces in this area. However, the situation remained unclear. Even at a higher level, no one could give us information about the exact location of the battle lines. At that moment, we didn't know whether to cry or laugh. While we were on patrol, a messenger on horseback approached us. We slowed down so as not to scare the horse, but when we caught up with him, the young horse reared up. Unfortunately, it was so close to the left track that my driver did not have time to brake in time. The animal was so seriously injured that the rider, who managed to jump off, had to shoot it to put it out of its misery. We put the messenger in the car and took him to his unit. There, I reported that he was in no way responsible for what had happened. On the way back, we noticed that the dead horse had disappeared. I found it in our field kitchen. My guys had taken it away in a tank. It supplemented our meager rations, since meat could be stored for more than a day in such cold weather. The next day, we had meatballs for dinner. Unaware of the incident, our commander ate 3 of them and praised the kitchen for taking care of us. But when I blurted out the truth to him, the poor guy almost threw up. After that, he only ate food that did not contain meat until he was sure that the last piece of horse meat had been used up. Trouble began again a few days later. We moved our guard a little higher up, to a place from which we could see the village of Sedigit Sovo better. The village itself was in our hands, but behind it were the Russians. We had to help repel an unexpected attack. In the evening, the Ivans began to advance from the thicket of the forest, 4 tanks and infantry. From our high position, it was not difficult to repel the attack. The tank commanders even climbed out of their tanks during the battle and directed the fire. 4 T-34 tanks caught fire. After that, the Russians retreated into the forest. The fighting continued until the end of the year. On November 25th, we had to support a battalion from the 503rd Infantry Regiment in an attack towards the forest west of Sedigit Sovo. According to the plan, the attack was to begin at dawn. Our 4 tanks took up their positions, and we saw something surprising. Our fellow infantrymen were running straight toward the forest. We were amazed by their rush, but even more surprised that the Russians were not stopping them. After advancing about 70 meters, we found the answer. The soldiers running toward the forest, as it turned out, were not our comrades, but Russians who had sneaked into our territory during the night. They were fleeing from our attack. Our infantrymen were in position with us on the right and left sides and were waiting for our actions. The Russians were incredibly lucky that we were deceived in the morning twilight. Now we had to deal with them in the forest, whereas we could have finished them off without any problems in the open field. Battalion Commander Hauptmann Johann Meyer was seriously wounded in the evening by a Soviet sniper hiding among the trees. We were all afraid that he would not make it to the medical battalion because his lung had been shot through. I was very happy when I received his congratulations in the hospital in 1944. Just before his serious injury, he became the 329th soldier to be nominated for the Knight's Cross with oak leaves. Because of his injury, he almost missed the award ceremony. On December 2nd, I was on a mission with Oberfeldwebel Sveti near Gorushka to cut off another part of the artery, advancing together with the infantry. The Russians were extremely well entrenched on a small but dominant hill. They always did this masterfully. Behind the hill, and on both sides of it, they had set up heavy weapons, such as anti-tank guns and the like. We couldn't get into a fight with them. We had to move along a road that led to a bridge that was completely unsuitable for crossing. The Russians had an excellent view and greeted us with a mortar attack. I almost killed the commander of the sappers, the Hauptmann. Since the bridge was out of the question, of course, he assured us that we could easily cross the ditch on the right side. He was, of course, not eager to reinforce the bridge in full view of the enemy. But I had no desire to get stuck in the moat and attempt to climb out of it under the Russians' noses. The Hauptmann soon appeared and demanded that I launch an attack immediately. Word for word, we quarreled, and the Russians accompanied our quarrel with a little friendly fire. When we finally resorted to expressions such as simulant, coward, and the like, I suddenly tore my iron cross off my jacket and threw it at his feet. I got into the car, drove away, and immediately climbed so deep that I could easily touch the ground with 1 foot from the height of the tower. The Hauptmann had learned his lesson, and, as they say, he disappeared without a trace. I couldn't blame him for the fact that the Ivans, who were watching our senseless quarrel from close range, were able to damage our turret hatches. I waved to Zvetti, and we hooked up the cable. It was just extraordinary luck that nothing else happened. Only a mortar shell fragment disfigured my temple. Stupidly, I allowed my gunner to pull out the fragment after we freed our vehicle from captivity. It took a lot of effort to pull it out onto level ground. Meanwhile, the wound began to bleed profusely. A large vein was probably affected, and Zvetti had to apply a pressure bandage. Our medical instructor proved to be up to the task. I now had a beautiful white turban on my head. It served as excellent camouflage against the snowy landscape. We had already painted the tanks white, as is customary in winter. My head was almost invisible from a distance. Every cloud has a silver lining. That evening, the sapper captain sent me my award along with a letter. He apologized and assured me that we could discuss the bridge the next morning. With the first rays of the sun, we eliminated the bone of contention without any particular problems. To be honest, it swayed a little, but it held. With luck and skill, we crossed the minefield. Chetty followed in the tracks of my tank. We were right in front of the Russians and could see their single trenches on the front slope. Then we gave our infantry a little breather. Zvetti quickly dealt with the 2 anti-tank guns that were covering the minefield. The guys to our right now started firing at us with anti-tank rifles. After a short time, none of our observation devices were working. Zvetti tried unsuccessfully to spot at least one of these shooters, but these guys kept changing position and then disappearing again in a flash. We oriented ourselves by the shooting, which was going on along the entire length of the trenches. However, the Russians were so confident that they even threw hand grenades from their cover. When we advanced a little, the first anti-tank shell whistled over my head. It seemed pointless to move forward until the infantry caught up with us. So we stood there for several hours without seeing any of our comrades. They didn't come out of their trenches at all, because the Russians controlled the entire area from their trees. We even had to seal the hatches because we were afraid the Russians would shoot us from above. Towards evening, Zvetti showed me a puddle under my tank. I had a bad feeling. The driver started the engine, and the thermometer immediately jumped to over 250 degrees. The Russians had shot a hole in the radiator with their anti-tank guns and mortars. What could we do? Leaving the vehicle or towing it was impossible in our situation. Therefore, we had to try to return across the bridge under our own power. Misfortune brings people together. Pz.VI forgot to switch to receive. This meant that I had excellent reception and could hear the conversation in his tank, something that did not interest me much at the time. These are the things that make you realize how necessary the hated military training is. The radio operator was drilled a dozen times a day that he had to switch to receive immediately after receiving a radio call. And now it all turned out to be useless anyway. I started waving my headphones out of the hatch, wanting to show Pz.VI that I wanted to talk to him. There was no time to waste because of the continuously leaking radiator. Finally, he noticed me waving and rudely reprimanded his radio operator. I could hear it too. I controlled the tank's movement through the minefield. The driver had to drive blind, but he got us through. With great excitement, we reached the bridge, which had been damaged during our first crossing and was sagging in the middle. We took a chance, and after about 100 meters, we were out of sight of the Russians, protected by the low trees of the swampy forest. We no longer attempted to attack at this location. It was simply impossible for the infantry. No one could have reached that height alive, even though it was within arm's reach. On December 12th, we were sent to Lvovsk via the Vitebsk-Nevel highway. The Russians were putting pressure on our positions there from the east across a wide front. For the first couple of days, we had only one task. We had to drive several kilometers up and down the highway, giving the Russians the impression that there were larger tank formations there. On December 16th, with the support of armored vehicles, the enemy attempted to attack from behind the hill where we had already knocked out a Russian anti-tank gun a few weeks earlier. We immediately counterattacked successfully. During the battle, we knocked out many enemy tanks. The Russians could have avoided these losses if they had moved down the hill with their entire tank force. However, they moved cautiously, somewhat nervously, and one after another. We dealt with them without haste. Russian fighter planes also caused us a lot of trouble. They dove at us almost continuously. It takes skill to describe how they fly. My gunner, Sergeant Kramer, deserves praise for what he did, and probably nothing on the Eastern Front can compare to it. Namely, he managed to hit a Russian fighter with a tank gun. Of course, he was also lucky. Here's how it happened. Kramer, annoyed by the persistence of these guys, raised his gun along the trajectory of the approaching fighter. I persuaded him to do so. He seized the moment and pulled the trigger. On his second attempt, he hit one of the Bs in the wing. The Russian crashed behind us. On the same day, we received another piece of comforting news. 2 Russian fighters collided and destroyed each other in the air before crashing. In the evening, I had a briefing with the commander of the infantry regiment. It lasted longer than expected. Finally, around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I was able to head back. On the way, I met our infantry in front of the highway. The troops were just taking up their positions. From time to time, the Russians opened fire with carbines or machine guns across the road. Just before the place where I knew my tanks were located, I calmly proceeded along the road leading south, that is, home. The tank crews were reduced to 2 men per vehicle. They had been looking for me. My long absence had upset them. We were very happy to see each other again. Chetty told me that our front line had been breached along the highway I was traveling down. The road was in no man's land. Meanwhile, the enemy was constantly receiving reinforcements. It was very difficult for us to hold our positions. Russian troops and military equipment were arriving from the east in trucks with their headlights on. They were not bothered by our resistance. Our artillery fired sporadically, which was not continuous while the enemy columns were in sight. The next day, we attacked again along the highway leading north. We wanted to give our infantry a chance to recapture the position they had lost the previous day. The Russians were already just to the right of the road. Katyusha rocket launchers, placed in the open, were aimed directly at us. A rocket hit the front armor of my tank. Chetty asked over the radio what had happened. At first, he couldn't see anything through the smoke. We were lucky. We then quickly got out of the enemy's sight. Despite repeated attempts, our infantry was unable to advance east across the road. The Russians, on the other hand, began to cross from the other side. Watching this, we couldn't help but admire the coolness of the Soviet commissar, who stood right in the thick of the battle and stubbornly led his men forward, giving commands with a wave of his hand. It was as if the machine guns were unable to hit him. We were enraged, and the Daredevil was thrown into the air by the explosion of an 88mm Kramer cannon shell. Then, the Russians ran back across the highway. Despite this, our offensive failed. A new front line was formed much further west. When I returned to the regimental command post, I found the commander in a state of agitation. 2 Alsatians were missing. Strictly speaking, at this stage of the war, it was assumed that they would no longer be needed at the front. Because of their apparent reliability, someone had made an exception, and now there were fears that they had crossed the front line and revealed secrets. There was another unpleasant incident involving 2 captured Russian T-34 tanks. The 2 German tanks passed through the guard posts and returned in the evening twilight. Our anti-tank units, which had no idea that the tanks had German crews, immediately destroyed both vehicles. The Balkan Cross painted on them was indistinguishable in the dark. Since then, it has been impossible to get any of our people to sit in a captured tank. Our days in the Neville sector were numbered. New and difficult tasks awaited us south of Leningrad. The front near Neville had not yet stabilized when we quickly left to go to another loading station. We were even more needed for withdrawal operations in the Leningrad area. Our goal was the junction in Gachina on the Leningrad-Narva highway. As we left the Neville front, bridges and railways were already being blown up behind us. The front had to be pushed back a considerable distance again. Here, I should pay tribute to a special unit, the repair platoon of our repair company. These people did the impossible. The platoon commander, Lieutenant Ruvidel, would have much preferred to stay with his friends in the tank company, but he was indispensable. Only a man of extraordinary abilities could hold such a position. None of us envied him. Just try to imagine what the repair platoon's task was. These men, usually under enemy fire, had to tow immobilized tanks with their 18-ton tractors. In many cases, the heavy repair vehicles had to drive up to the very front lines and stay there at night. From there, they hauled away the tanks with winches, attaching their cables and pulling them out. On more or less level ground, this work was somewhat effective, as long as the infantry did not take any action and did not alarm the enemy with bursts of gunfire. But our people also had to do their job in snow and ice. The safe movement of a 60-ton Tiger tank by 2 tractors in tandem at the front required enormous experience and strong nerves. But if the enemy was hot on our heels, as was the case with all retreats in battle, a mistake usually meant the loss of the vehicle. We were lucky to reach the railway station before it was destroyed. We loaded up and headed towards Gachina. The great rush did not bode well. Anything could happen there, and once again we had a fire brigade mission. Our fears were confirmed. The main railway station in Gachina was already under artillery fire when we arrived, so we didn't have time to unload. To top it all off, we were informed that our first company had already entered the battle and was battered. It had been sent into battle straight from the unloading platform. The reason was that the Russians had broken through with superior forces to the west between Leningrad and Gachina. One of their main attacks was directed along the road along the coastline. Another attack was launched in the Pushkin area, east of Gachina. An unpleasant incident occurred with us, as I mentioned above. We reconnoitered all the bridges between Gachina and Leningrad to see if heavy tanks could cross them. This was done in advance, but our comrades arrived too late to blow up the bridges. We thus did practically all the work for Ivanov. Thanks to this, they were able to advance fairly quickly. Upon arrival, we learned the sad details of the defeat of the 1st Company. It was surrounded by Russian tanks on the highway. Lieutenant Meyer's platoon was almost completely destroyed. Meyer himself put a pistol to his head when the Russians tried to take him prisoner. We were devastated by this news. Deep down, I blamed the commander for not holding back his men who had engaged in combat until all the companies had assembled. Later, I realized that there was no other option. To a certain extent, each unit was moving into the unknown. No one had an accurate picture of the situation on the battlefield. Moreover, Major Yeda was the best commander of the 502nd Battalion. He was an example to us because he always stood up for his subordinates without exception and always appeared in critical situations. That's how we knew him, and that's why we will never forget him. That's all for today. If you liked the video, please support it with a like and subscribe to the channel. See you all soon.